A loud thud, followed by screams, echoed through the marble lobby of Grandview Towers, the sound ricocheting off polished walls like gunshots in a cathedral. The screams weren't just pain. They were terror, confusion, the kind of raw panic that cuts through the artificial civility of upscale apartment living and exposes something ugly underneath. Mrs. Patricia Williams, known to everyone as Pat, had been collecting her mail when she heard it. The sound made her blood freeze. She knew that voice. Kenny Morrison, the 12-year-old boy from 14B, who always smiled when he passed her in the hallway, his leg braces gleaming under the crystal chandeliers, was lying crumpled at the bottom of the grand staircase. "Someone call 911!" Pat shouted, her voice cracking as she rushed toward the boy. But even as she moved, her eyes caught sight of something that made her stomach twist. Karen Whitmore stood at the top of the stairs, her perfectly manicured hands pressed against her chest in a theatrical display of shock, her blonde hair still perfectly coiffed despite what had just happened. "Oh my goodness!" Karen gasped, her voice carrying just the right note of concerned neighbor. "I saw him stumble. These children, they just don't watch where they're going." But Pat had seen enough. In the split second before Kenny fell, she'd glimpsed Karen's hands extended, the slight pushing motion, the way the woman had stepped back immediately after. This wasn't an accident. This was assault. Kenny Morrison had moved into Grandview Towers 6 months earlier with his father, David. The boy had been born with spina bifida, requiring leg braces and frequent use of mobility aids. But his spirit remained unbroken. Every morning at exactly 7:30, he would make his way from the 14th floor to the lobby, taking the elevator down to catch his specialized school transport. Every afternoon at 3:45, he would return, navigating the elegant but challenging terrain of their luxury building with determination that impressed even the most jaded residents. David Morrison worked long hours as a consulting architect, specializing in accessibility compliance and adaptive design. He'd chosen Grandview Towers specifically because of its reputation for inclusivity and its modern accessibility features. The building boasted state-of-the-art elevators, ramps, and adaptive technologies that would make Kenny's daily life easier. What David hadn't anticipated was Karen Whitmore. Karen had lived in Grandview Towers for 8 years, serving on the Homeowners Association board for 6 of them. She considered herself the unofficial guardian of the building's standards, a role she'd appointed herself after what she called the decline in resident quality, following the building's expansion 3 years prior. Her complaints were legendary among building management. Too much noise from children playing, hallway decorations that didn't meet her aesthetic standards, delivery drivers who didn't dress appropriately for the lobby. The first time Karen noticed Kenny, she'd made a mental note. A disabled child meant potential problems, noise, inconvenience, disruption to the orderly flow of building life she'd worked so hard to maintain. When she learned he used the elevator daily, sometimes requiring extra time to maneuver his braces and backpack, her irritation crystallized into something darker. That boy is monopolizing the elevator. She'd complained to building manager Harrison Wells during one of her weekly visits to his office. "I've timed him. 47 seconds to get on, 38 seconds to get off. That's nearly a minute and a half per trip, twice a day. It's inconsiderate to other residents." Harrison had looked at her with barely concealed disgust. "Mrs. Whitmore, the boy is 12 years old and uses mobility aids. The elevator is there for all residents to use safely." "I'm not suggesting he can't use it," Karen had replied, her voice taking on that particular tone of wounded righteousness she'd perfected over the years. "I'm suggesting he be more considerate. Perhaps he could time his trips to avoid peak hours, or use the stairs when possible." "He has leg braces, Mrs. Whitmore." I'm aware of that. I'm simply saying that accommodations shouldn't come at the expense of other residents' convenience. Harrison had ended the meeting there, but Karen's complaints hadn't stopped. She'd started documenting Kenny's elevator usage, timing his trips, and correlating them with what she claimed were backup delays affecting other residents. She'd submitted formal complaints to the HOA board, the building management company, and even the city's housing authority, each time couching her discrimination in the language of efficiency and consideration for others. For his part, Kenny remained oblivious to Karen's campaign against him. He was focused on more important things: his seventh-grade history project on the civil rights movement, his growing collection of Marvel comic books, and his father's promise to take him to see the new Spider-Man movie over the weekend. The adult world of building politics and social hierarchies existed outside his awareness, a luxury his father tried hard to preserve. David Morrison had built his career on creating spaces where everyone could thrive. His specialty in adaptive architecture had grown from personal experience. His younger brother had used a wheelchair, and David had witnessed firsthand how poorly designed environments could exclude and diminish people. When Kenny was born, David's professional mission became deeply personal. Every building he designed, every consultation he provided, every accessibility audit he conducted was informed by his understanding of how the built environment could either enable or disable human potential. Grandview Towers had actually been one of his projects, though not many residents knew this. 5 years earlier, the building's original developers had hired his firm to conduct a comprehensive accessibility review and retrofit. David had spent months in the building, examining every corridor, every elevator, every public space, ensuring they met not just legal requirements, but best practices for inclusive design. The work had been extensive and expensive, but the result was a building that truly accommodated residents with varying mobility needs. The irony wasn't lost on him when he'd moved in with Kenny 6 months ago. He was living in a building he'd helped make accessible, watching his son navigate spaces he'd specifically designed for children like him. It should have been perfect, and for the most part, it was. Kenny loved their apartment, with its wide doorways and accessible bathroom fixtures. He'd made friends with other children in the building, including 8-year-old Maya Chen from the 9th floor, who thought Kenny's braces were super cool and often asked to race him down the hallway. But David had noticed the tension. The way some residents looked at Kenny with barely concealed impatience when the elevator took an extra moment. The whispered conversations that stopped when they approached. The complaints he'd started receiving through building management about noise disturbances from their unit. Despite Kenny's naturally quiet nature and their careful attention to sound management, most of the complaints, David had learned, came from Karen Whitmore. He'd never met her directly, but her name appeared on every piece of correspondence, every formal objection, every request for enhanced consideration of all residents' needs. Her language was careful, legally conscious, but the intent was clear. She wanted Kenny gone. The morning of the incident had started normally. Kenny had eaten his usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, while telling David about the presentation he was giving that day on Harriet Tubman. His enthusiasm was infectious. He'd spent weeks researching the Underground Railroad, fascinated by the networks of safe houses and secret routes that had helped enslaved people find freedom. "Did you know she made 19 trips into the South?" Kenny had said, gesturing excitedly with his fork. "And she never lost a single person. Not one. Dad, that's incredible leadership." David had smiled, pride swelling in his chest. His son's natural gravitation toward stories of courage and justice never failed to amaze him. "It sounds like you're really prepared. I wish I could be there to see it." "That's okay. Ms. Rodriguez said she's going to record some of the presentations. Maybe you can watch it tonight." "I'd love that." They'd left the apartment together at 7:25. Kenny's presentation materials carefully organized in his backpack, alongside his usual school supplies. The elevator had arrived promptly, and Kenny had positioned himself carefully inside, using the handrail for stability as they descended. David had kissed his son goodbye in the lobby, watching as Kenny made his way toward the main entrance where his school transport waited. David had then headed to his car in the underground garage, completely unaware that Karen Whitmore had been watching from the mailroom. She'd timed the entire interaction. Elevator call to departure 3 minutes and 12 seconds. In her mind, this was evidence of the daily disruption Kenny caused to building operations. Karen had been particularly agitated that morning. The previous evening, she'd received a response from the building management company regarding her latest formal complaint about Kenny's elevator usage. The response had been brief and legal in tone, essentially informing her that the building was fully ADA compliant and that all residents had equal rights to use building amenities as needed. Furthermore, they'd advised her that continued complaints about a disabled child's accommodation needs could potentially constitute harassment under federal disability law. The response had enraged Karen. How dare they suggest she was harassing anyone? She was simply advocating for efficiency and consideration. Her complaints were reasonable, measured, and focused on building operations, not personal characteristics. The fact that they'd even mentioned federal disability law felt like a threat, an attempt to silence legitimate concerns about building management. She'd spent the evening researching ADA requirements, looking for loopholes or limitations that might support her position. What she'd found instead was a comprehensive framework of protections that seemed to anticipate and counter every argument she'd been making. The right to equal access, the requirement for reasonable accommodations, the prohibition against policies that had a disparate impact on disabled individuals, even if they appeared neutral on their face. Reading through the regulations had only intensified her frustration. It seemed to Karen that the rights of one disabled child were being elevated above the convenience of dozens of other residents. Where was the balance? Where was the consideration for everyone else's needs? By morning, her resentment had crystallized into determination. She would document everything, every delay, every inconvenience, every moment of disruption caused by Kenny's presence in the building. She would build an irrefutable case that accommodating his needs was creating an undue burden on other residents. There had to be limits to what they were required to tolerate. Karen had positioned herself in the mailroom that morning, specifically to observe and time Kenny's routine. She'd brought a stopwatch and a notebook, planning to create a detailed log of his elevator usage patterns. What she hadn't expected was to encounter Kenny again that afternoon. Returning from school earlier than usual, Kenny had been excited about his presentation. He'd nailed every point about Harriet Tubman's courage and strategic thinking, earning applause from his classmates and praise from Ms. Rodriguez. The teacher had indeed recorded his presentation and promised to email the video to his father that evening. Kenny couldn't wait to share the news. His school transport had dropped him off at Grandview Towers at 3:15, 30 minutes earlier than usual due to an abbreviated school day. Kenny had entered the lobby with his usual cheerful demeanor, greeting the doorman and heading toward the elevator bank. He'd pressed the call button and waited, humming the theme song from his favorite video game. The elevator had been occupied when it arrived, 3 residents from the upper floors heading down to the garage. Kenny had waited politely for them to exit before positioning himself inside and pressing the button for the 14th floor. The process had taken perhaps 90 seconds, well within the normal range for any resident managing typical loads of groceries, packages, or personal items. But Karen had been watching from the mailroom, stopwatch in hand. To her, those 90 seconds represented a clear disruption to building flow. She'd noted the time, 3:17 p.m., peak afternoon period when residents were returning from work and school, maximum inconvenience to others. When the elevator had returned to the lobby level at 3:21, Karen had been waiting. She'd positioned herself strategically near the elevator bank, ostensibly checking her mail, but actually preparing to time Kenny's next trip. She knew he often made a second journey to retrieve items from his father's car or to visit friends in the building. Sure enough, at 3:23, Kenny had emerged from the stairwell. He'd forgotten his water bottle in the school transport and wanted to check if it was still outside. He'd approached the elevator and pressed the call button, still humming his video game theme song. That's when Karen had snapped. "Excuse me," she'd said sharply, approaching Kenny with her notebook and stopwatch visible in her hands. "You just used the elevator 5 minutes ago." Kenny had looked up at her, confused. He'd seen her around the building but had never spoken to her directly. "Yes, ma'am. I forgot something downstairs." "You're holding up other residents," Karen had continued, her voice rising. "This elevator isn't your personal transportation service. Other people need to use it too." Kenny had felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He'd looked around the lobby, noticing that they were the only two people waiting for the elevator. "I'm sorry, but I don't see anyone else waiting." "That's not the point," Karen had snapped. "The point is efficiency, consideration. You can't just monopolize building resources because of your situation." The way she'd said situation had made something cold settle in Kenny's stomach. He'd encountered this tone before, the particular way some adults spoke about his braces and mobility needs. It was different from curiosity or genuine concern. It carried an undercurrent of blame, as if his disability was a choice he'd made to inconvenience others. "I need the elevator to get upstairs," Kenny had said quietly, his earlier enthusiasm about his presentation evaporating. "I can't use the stairs very well." "Can't or won't," Karen had demanded. "I've seen you walking perfectly fine in the hallways. Maybe if you tried harder, you wouldn't need to rely on accommodations all the time." The elevator had arrived with a soft chime, its doors sliding open to reveal the familiar mahogany interior and brass fixtures. Kenny had moved forward, eager to escape the confrontation, but Karen had stepped partially into his path. "I'm talking to you," she'd said. "It's rude to walk away when someone is speaking." "I need to go upstairs," Kenny had repeated, his voice smaller now. The confidence he'd felt during his presentation that morning seemed like a distant memory. "What you need is to learn some consideration for others," Karen had said, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "Your father should have taught you better manners." That had stung. Kenny adored his father, admired everything about him, from his successful career to his patient way of explaining complex architectural concepts in terms Kenny could understand. The idea that his father had somehow failed him was both painful and confusing. "My dad teaches me lots of things," Kenny had said, some of his earlier spirit returning. "He taught me that everyone deserves to be treated with respect." Karen's face had flushed red. "Don't get smart with me. Young man, I'm trying to help you understand how to be more considerate of others. Clearly, your father hasn't explained that your needs don't supersede everyone else's." Kenny had stepped fully into the elevator, hoping to end the conversation by closing the doors. But Karen had followed him inside, her presence filling the small space with tension and anger. "I'm not done talking to you," she'd said. "You're going to listen to what I have to say about being a better neighbor." The elevator had begun its ascent, and Kenny had pressed himself against the back wall. Suddenly aware of how trapped he was, Karen had loomed over him, her perfectly styled appearance somehow making her anger more intimidating. "Every day, you hold up this elevator," she'd continued, her voice rising despite the confined space. Every day, you make other residents wait while you take your sweet time getting on and off. Do you think that's fair? Do you think your comfort is more important than everyone else's? I try to be fast, Kenny had whispered. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. I don't mean to bother anyone. But you do bother people. Karen had said, you bother me. Every single day. Your noise in the hallways. Your slow movements. Your constant need for special treatment. This building was peaceful before you arrived. The elevator had reached the 14th floor with another soft chime, and Kenny had moved quickly toward the opening doors. But as he'd stepped out, Karen had grabbed his shoulder and spun him around to face her. Where do you think you're going? I said I wasn't done talking to you. Please let me go, Kenny had said, tears beginning to form in his eyes. I want to go home. You'll go home when I say you can go home, Karen had replied, her grip tightening on his shoulder. First, you're going to promise me that you'll be more considerate. You're going to limit your elevator use to once per trip. You're going to time your movements to avoid peak hours. And you're going to stop making so much noise in the hallways. Kenny had tried to pull away, but Karen's grip was firm. The hallway was empty, most residents still at work or school, and her voice echoed off the walls. Promise me, she'd demanded. Say that you'll be more considerate of other residents. I already try to be considerate, Kenny had said, his voice cracking. I don't understand what you want me to do differently. What I want is for you to stop being so selfish. Karen had snapped. What I want is for you to realize that the world doesn't revolve around your needs. What I want is for you to show some respect for the adults in this building who know better than you do. She'd released his shoulder suddenly, and Kenny had stumbled backward, his braces making balance difficult on the polished floor. But instead of heading toward his apartment, he'd turned toward the stairwell, desperate to escape Karen's presence, even if it meant navigating the stairs with his mobility challenges. Karen had followed him, her anger now fully unleashed. Don't you dare walk away from me, she'd shouted. I'm trying to help you become a better person, and you're being completely disrespectful. Kenny had reached the stairwell door and pulled it open, but the stairs stretched below him like a daunting obstacle course. 14 flights down to the lobby. His braces made stair navigation slow and careful, requiring him to hold the handrail and take one step at a time. You see, Karen had said, appearing beside him at the top of the stairs. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't even commit to using the stairs instead of monopolizing the elevator. You're lazy and inconsiderate. I'm not lazy, Kenny had said, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. The stairs are hard for me. Everything is hard for you. Isn't it? Karen had replied mockingly. Poor Kenny. Life is so difficult. Well, let me tell you something. Young man, life is difficult for everyone. The rest of us just don't expect the world to bend over backward to accommodate us. Kenny had begun his careful descent, gripping the handrail tightly as he navigated each step. His braces clicked against the concrete stairs, echoing in the narrow stairwell. Behind him, Karen had continued her tirade. This is what you should do every time instead of holding up the elevator. She'd said, this is what consideration looks like. Taking the harder path so others don't have to be inconvenienced by your problems. Kenny had been 3 steps down when it happened. Karen's hand had shot out, making contact with his back, and suddenly he was falling forward. His careful balance destroyed, his grip on the handrail torn away by the force of the push. The world had become a blur of concrete steps and metal railings rushing past him. His backpack had flown off his shoulders, its contents scattering across the stairs. The sound of his braces striking the concrete had mixed with his screams, creating a horrible symphony that echoed through the stairwell and out into the lobby below. When Kenny had finally come to rest at the bottom of the first flight, his body crumpled against the landing. The screams that had started in terror had transformed into something else. Pain, confusion, the kind of raw vulnerability that comes from being hurt by someone who was supposed to be a safe adult. Karen had stood at the top of the stairs for several seconds, looking down at the boy she'd just pushed. In that moment, reality had crashed over her like a cold wave. What had she done? The anger that had seemed so justified moments before now looked like what it truly was: the assault of a disabled child by an adult who had let her prejudices and entitlement overwhelm her basic humanity. But Karen Whitmore had not survived 8 years on an HOA board without learning how to manage optics. By the time she'd reached the lobby, her story was already forming. Kenny had stumbled. She'd tried to help, but hadn't been able to catch him. A tragic accident, really. The kind of thing that happens when children don't watch where they're going. The lobby had filled quickly with concerned residents and building staff. Harrison Wells had arrived within minutes. Having been called by the doorman, the building's security cameras had captured Kenny's fall from multiple angles, but the stairwell cameras had been positioned to monitor landings, not individual steps. The crucial moment when Karen's hand had made contact with Kenny's back had occurred in a blind spot. Mrs. Patricia Williams had knelt beside Kenny as they waited for the paramedics, her hands gentle as she tried to assess his injuries without moving him. She'd spoken in soothing tones, asking about his pain levels and trying to keep him calm until professional help arrived. "Can you move your fingers for me, sweetheart?" she'd asked. And Kenny had wiggled his fingers weakly, tears still streaming down his face. "It hurts," he'd whispered. "My leg hurts, and my shoulder." "I know. Honey, help is coming. You're going to be okay." But even as she'd comforted Kenny, Pat's eyes had remained fixed on Karen Whitmore, who had positioned herself near the mail area, accepting sympathy from other residents who had arrived to see what had happened. Karen's performance had been flawless, the concerned neighbor, shocked by the accident, grateful that she'd been there to witness it and provide details to the emergency responders. "He was moving so quickly," Karen had told Harrison Wells, her voice carrying just the right note of regret. "I tried to tell him to be careful. But you know how children are. They don't listen." Harrison had nodded, but Pat had caught the look in his eyes. He'd been dealing with Karen's complaints about Kenny for months. This felt too convenient, too perfectly timed to be a simple accident. When the paramedics had arrived, they'd been professional and efficient, carefully evaluating Kenny's injuries before moving him to a stretcher. A sprained shoulder, bruised ribs, and aggravation of the spinal condition that had required his leg braces in the first place. Not life-threatening, but serious enough to require hospital evaluation and several days of modified activity. David Morrison had received the call while reviewing blueprints for a new civic center in downtown Chicago. The voice on the other end, Harrison Wells, introducing himself as the building manager, had delivered the news with careful professionalism. "Mr. Morrison, there's been an incident involving your son. He fell in the stairwell and is being transported to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. His injuries don't appear to be life-threatening, but you should meet them there." The 40-minute drive to the hospital had been the longest of David's life. His mind had raced through possibilities, each more frightening than the last. Kenny rarely used the stairs alone, understanding the challenges they presented for his mobility. What had he been doing in the stairwell? Why hadn't he used the elevator as usual? At the hospital, David had found Kenny in an emergency room bed, looking small and vulnerable in the hospital gown. his leg braces set aside on a nearby chair. His left shoulder had been immobilized in a sling, and there were scrapes on his arms and face from his tumble down the concrete steps. "Dad," Kenny had said when he'd seen David approaching, fresh tears welling in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to fall." "Hey, buddy," David had said softly, taking Kenny's uninjured hand. "You don't have anything to be sorry about. Are you okay? How are you feeling?" "My shoulder hurts, and my back feels funny. The doctor said I have to wear this sling for a week." Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, had approached them with Kenny's chart and a reassuring but serious expression. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Dr. Chen. Kenny's injuries are painful, but not severe. The sprained shoulder will heal completely with rest and physical therapy. We're more concerned about the impact on his underlying spinal condition. I'd like to keep him overnight for observation and arrange follow-up with his regular orthopedist." David had nodded, relief flooding through him that Kenny's injuries weren't worse, but questions had remained. "Doctor, can you tell me how this happened? The building manager said he fell in the stairwell, but Kenny usually uses the elevator." Dr. Chen had glanced at Kenny, then back at David. "Perhaps we could speak privately for a moment." They'd stepped into the hallway, where Dr. Chen had lowered her voice. Kenny told the nurse that an adult woman had been yelling at him about using the elevator. He said he tried to use the stairs to avoid making her angry, but she followed him and kept yelling. He's quite upset about it. David's jaw had tightened. "Did he say the woman pushed him?" "He's not entirely clear about that part. He said she was behind him on the stairs, still yelling. And then he was falling. It's possible the confrontation disoriented him enough that he lost his balance." But David had known his son. Kenny was careful, cautious, particularly on stairs. He'd been navigating them with braces for years and understood his limitations. The idea that he'd simply lost his balance seemed unlikely. That evening, as Kenny had slept in his hospital bed, David had called Harrison Wells for more details about the incident. Harrison had been forthcoming about the situation, including Karen Whitmore's presence and her account of events. "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Morrison," Harrison had said. "Mrs. Whitmore has been filing complaints about your son's elevator usage for months. She's claimed it's disruptive to other residents and has requested various accommodations to limit his access during what she calls peak hours." David had felt a familiar anger building in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd experienced countless times throughout his career when encountering discrimination disguised as policy concerns. What kind of complaints? Timing his elevator trips, claiming they caused delays, suggesting he use stairs during busy periods. "We've responded that the building is ADA compliant and that all residents have equal access to amenities. But she's been persistent. And now my son is in the hospital after an encounter with her in the stairwell. I want to be clear that we have no evidence Mrs. Whitmore did anything improper. She maintains that she witnessed Kenny fall and tried to help." But David had heard something in Harrison's tone that suggested he had his own doubts about Karen's version of events. "I'd like to review any security footage from the incident." "Of course. I'll arrange for you to meet with our security director tomorrow." The next morning, David had sat in Harrison's office reviewing security footage from multiple cameras throughout the building. The videos had painted a disturbing picture. Karen approaching Kenny at the elevator, clearly agitated. The two of them entering the elevator together, with Karen appearing to be speaking intensely to the clearly uncomfortable boy. Their emergence on the 14th floor, with Kenny trying to move away from Karen, who had grabbed his shoulder. The footage had then shown their movement toward the stairwell, Karen following closely behind Kenny, her body language aggressive and confrontational. The stairwell cameras had captured Kenny's careful descent, and Karen standing at the top of the stairs, clearly speaking to him. But the crucial moment had occurred in a blind spot between camera angles. "I want to file a police report," David had said after reviewing the footage. Harrison had nodded. "I think that's appropriate. I'll provide copies of all relevant footage and documentation." But David had known that proving assault would be difficult without direct evidence of the push. Karen's story about witnessing an accidental fall would be hard to contradict legally. What he could prove was a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and discrimination that had culminated in his disabled son being injured. As an expert in accessibility compliance, David had understood exactly what legal protections Kenny had and how Karen's behavior had violated them. But, as a father, he'd wanted something more immediate and complete. He'd wanted justice, not just for Kenny, but for every disabled person who had ever been made to feel unwelcome in spaces they had every right to occupy. The police report had been filed that afternoon, with Detective Maria Santos taking detailed statements from David, Kenny, and several witnesses who had seen the aftermath of the incident. Kenny had been able to provide more details about his conversation with Karen, including her demands that he limit his elevator usage, and her comments about his disability being an inconvenience to others. "She said I was lazy," Kenny had told Detective Santos, his voice still shaky from the previous day's trauma. "She said I was being selfish and that other people were more important than me." Detective Santos had taken careful notes, her expression growing more serious as Kenny recounted the confrontation. When she'd interviewed Karen later that day, the woman had maintained her story about witnessing an accidental fall, but her account of the preceding conversation had been notably different from Kenny's version. "I was simply trying to help the boy understand building etiquette," Karen had told the detective. "Children sometimes need guidance about being considerate of others. I certainly never said anything inappropriate about his disability." But Detective Santos had been thorough in her investigation. She'd interviewed other residents, including Mrs. Patricia Williams, who had provided a detailed account of Karen's suspicious behavior immediately after Kenny's fall. She'd reviewed building management's records of Karen's complaints about Kenny, establishing a clear pattern of discriminatory harassment. Most importantly, she'd discovered that Karen's story about the incident had changed subtly between her initial statement to building management and her formal statement to police. Small inconsistencies that suggested reconstruction rather than genuine memory. 3 days after the incident, Detective Santos had enough evidence to arrest Karen Whitmore on charges of assault and battery of a minor, as well as civil rights violations under both state and federal disability protection laws. The arrest had taken place at Grandview Towers, in the same lobby where Kenny had fallen, with several residents witnessing Karen being led away in handcuffs. But David had known that criminal charges were only the beginning. Karen's behavior represented a broader problem with how disabled people were treated in housing, employment, and public accommodations. Her complaints about Kenny hadn't existed in a vacuum. They'd been enabled by systems and attitudes that prioritized the comfort of non-disabled people over the rights of disabled individuals. As the regional ADA enforcement officer for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, David had access to resources and expertise that most parents in his situation wouldn't have. He'd spent years investigating discrimination complaints, crafting settlement agreements, and developing policies to prevent exactly the kind of treatment Kenny had experienced. The irony hadn't been lost on him. Karen Whitmore had chosen to target the child of one of the most qualified ADA enforcement professionals in the region. Her discrimination against Kenny had occurred in a building that David himself had helped design to be fully accessible. She'd violated federal law in front of someone who wrote federal enforcement policy. But rather than simply pursuing individual justice for Kenny, David had decided to use the incident as an opportunity to address systemic issues. He'd begun documenting not just Karen's specific actions, but the broader culture of discrimination that had allowed her behavior to continue unchecked for months. Building management had received formal complaints about Karen's harassment, but had treated them as personality conflicts rather than potential civil rights violations. The HOA board, of which Karen was a member, had failed to recognize that her complaints about Kenny's elevator usage constituted discriminatory targeting of a disabled resident. David had started by requesting comprehensive records from Grandview Towers management and the HOA board. Every complaint Karen had filed about Kenny, every communication between building management and residents regarding Kenny's presence in the building, every HOA board meeting where Kenny or disability accommodations had been discussed. What he'd found had been even worse than he'd expected. Karen's complaints had been detailed, persistent, and increasingly focused on Kenny's personal characteristics rather than specific behaviors. She'd timed his movements, documented his routes through the building, and proposed specific restrictions on his access to common areas. More disturbing, she'd begun building support among other residents for her position. She'd circulated emails suggesting that Kenny's presence was negatively affecting property values. She'd proposed HOA policies that would limit access to building amenities during certain hours. Policies that would have disproportionately affected residents with mobility impairments. The HOA board had actually considered some of Karen's proposals, discussing them in meetings where neither David nor Kenny had been present or notified. Only the intervention of Harrison Wells, who'd recognized the discriminatory nature of the proposals, had prevented their implementation. David had realized that Kenny's case represented more than individual harassment. It was systematic discrimination enabled by institutional indifference and disguised as reasonable policymaking. The kind of subtle, pervasive discrimination that was often harder to combat than overt hostility because it hid behind language of efficiency and mutual consideration. 2 weeks after Kenny's fall, David had made a decision that would change everything. He'd called a press conference. The press conference had been held in the community room of Grandview Towers, the same elegant space where HOA meetings were conducted and where Karen had planned to propose her restrictions on Kenny's building access. David had invited local media, disability rights organizations, and federal housing officials to hear Kenny's story and learn about the broader implications of housing discrimination against disabled individuals. Kenny had been nervous about speaking publicly, but he'd wanted to tell his story. With his arm still in a sling and his father beside him, he'd faced the cameras and reporters with remarkable composure. "My name is Kenny Morrison, and I'm 12 years old." He'd begun, his voice clear despite his nervousness. 2 weeks ago, I was pushed down the stairs in my building by an adult who said I was using the elevator too much because of my leg braces. The room had been silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters and the scratching of reporters' pens. Kenny's simple, direct account of his experience had been powerful in its clarity. "I don't understand why she was so angry at me." Kenny had continued. "I try to be polite to everyone in the building. I say hello to people in the hallways. I hold doors for people when I can. But she said I was selfish and lazy because I need extra time to get on and off the elevator." David had then provided context for Kenny's experience, explaining how housing discrimination against disabled individuals often manifested in exactly these kinds of complaints about accommodation abuse or special treatment. He'd outlined the legal protections that should have prevented Karen's harassment and the institutional failures that had allowed it to continue. "My son was targeted for assault because he has a disability and because an adult resident decided his convenience was more important than Kenny's civil rights." David had said, "But this isn't just about one incident or one individual. This is about a culture that treats disabled people as burdens rather than community members with equal rights to housing. The press coverage had been extensive and largely sympathetic. Kenny's story had resonated with viewers and readers, particularly the image of a 12-year-old boy being confronted and ultimately injured by an adult neighbor over his use of an elevator. The contrast between Kenny's polite, thoughtful demeanor and Karen's aggressive discrimination had been stark. But the real impact had come from David's detailed presentation of the institutional failures that had enabled Karen's behavior. He'd shown reporters the timeline of complaints, the HOA board discussions of discriminatory policies, and the building management's inadequate response to clear signs of harassment. Within days, Grandview Towers had become a case study in housing discrimination. Disability rights organizations had announced plans to audit other properties managed by the same company. Federal housing officials had opened a formal investigation into the building's compliance with fair housing laws. The HOA board had faced calls for complete restructuring. Karen Whitmore had found herself at the center of a national conversation about disability, discrimination, and housing. Her arrest photos had appeared in newspapers and on television, alongside descriptions of her systematic harassment of a disabled child. Her carefully constructed image as a concerned neighbor protecting building standards had been revealed as discriminatory targeting, disguised as policy advocacy. The legal consequences had been swift and severe. In addition to the criminal charges for assault and civil rights violations, Karen had faced federal charges under the Fair Housing Act. The Department of Justice had filed a civil lawsuit seeking monetary damages and injunctive relief to prevent further discrimination. But perhaps more devastating to Karen had been the social and professional consequences. She'd been removed from the HOA board by emergency vote. Her employer, a marketing firm that worked with several disability service organizations, had terminated her employment after the press coverage. She'd been asked to resign from her volunteer positions with 2 charitable organizations that served vulnerable populations. The building management company had implemented comprehensive fair housing training for all staff and board members. They'd adopted new policies, specifically addressing discrimination complaints, and established clear procedures for responding to harassment of disabled residents. Harrison Wells had been promoted to regional manager, partly in recognition of his efforts to protect Kenny from Karen's escalating campaign. Most significantly, the incident had prompted legislative action. The state had passed new requirements for HOA board training on fair housing law, including specific education about disability discrimination. Federal housing officials had used Kenny's case as the basis for updated enforcement guidance on accommodation harassment. 6 months after the incident, Karen Whitmore had pleaded guilty to assault charges and civil rights violations. She'd been sentenced to probation, community service, and mandatory education about disability rights. She'd also been required to pay restitution to Kenny for his medical expenses and emotional distress. The civil lawsuit had been settled for an undisclosed amount, with Karen agreeing to a consent decree that prohibited her from serving on HOA boards or property management organizations for 10 years. She'd also been required to complete sensitivity training and make a formal apology to Kenny and the disabled community. But for Kenny and David, the most important outcome had been the change in their building community. Residents had rallied around Kenny, organizing events to support him and expressing outrage about the discrimination he'd faced. Maya Chen from the 9th floor had started a Kenny's Friends group among the building's children, focused on inclusion and kindness. Mrs. Patricia Williams had become a fierce advocate for disability rights, using her experience witnessing Kenny's assault to educate other residents about recognizing and preventing discrimination. She'd worked with David to develop building policies that proactively supported disabled residents, rather than merely meeting minimum legal requirements. The building had also established a memorial scholarship in Kenny's name. supporting educational opportunities for disabled students interested in architecture and accessible design. The scholarship had been funded through donations from residents who wanted to turn the tragedy of Kenny's assault into something positive and lasting. Kenny himself had recovered fully from his physical injuries, though the emotional impact of the incident had taken longer to heal. He'd worked with a counselor to process the trauma of being targeted and assaulted by an adult neighbor, learning strategies for handling discrimination and building resilience. Most importantly, Kenny had found his voice as an advocate. He'd spoken at school assemblies about disability, awareness, and inclusion. He'd testified before the city council about the need for stronger enforcement of accessibility requirements. He'd even been invited to speak at a national conference on fair housing, where his presentation about what adults don't understand about being different had received a standing ovation. David had been promoted to National Director of ADA Enforcement, partly based on his innovative work using Kenny's case to develop new approaches to combating housing discrimination. He'd written extensively about the incident, contributing to academic journals and policy publications about the intersection of disability rights and fair housing law. But beyond the professional recognition, David had been most proud of Kenny's growth and resilience. His son had faced discrimination and assault with grace and courage, transforming a traumatic experience into an opportunity to educate others and advocate for change. The morning of the first anniversary of the incident, Kenny had stood in the lobby of Grandview Towers, holding a plaque that would be mounted near the elevator bank. The plaque read, "In recognition of Kenny Morrison's courage and the community's commitment to inclusion, dignity, and equal access for all residents." As Kenny had looked around the lobby, the same space where he'd been confronted and where he'd later fallen down the stairs, he'd felt not fear or sadness, but pride. This was his home. These were his neighbors. And while one person had tried to make him feel unwelcome, an entire community had ultimately stood up to say that discrimination had no place in their building. Harrison Wells had been there for the plaque dedication, along with Mrs. Williams, Maya Chen and her family, and dozens of other residents who had come to know Kenny not as the disabled boy who used the elevator too much, but as a bright, kind, determined young person who had taught them all something important about courage, inclusion, and standing up for what's right. David had watched from the back of the crowd as Kenny spoke briefly about the importance of treating everyone with kindness and respect. His son's voice was strong and clear, filled with the confidence that comes from knowing you belong, knowing you're valued, and knowing that your community will protect your right to exist in shared spaces. As the ceremony concluded and residents began to disperse, Kenny had approached the elevator and pressed the call button. When the doors opened, several other residents had stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter, first not out of pity or special accommodation, but out of simple courtesy, the kind of basic respect that every person deserves. Kenny had smiled as the elevator began its ascent to the 14th floor. Through the glass elevator walls, he could see his building stretching above and below him, full of families and individuals living their lives, pursuing their dreams, building their communities. Some of them were disabled, some were not. Some were children, some were adults, some were new to the building, some had lived there for years. What they all shared was the right to call Grandview Towers home, the right to use building amenities safely and without harassment, the right to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their personal characteristics or accommodation needs. These were rights that Kenny had always possessed, but that one person had tried to deny him. The fact that he'd reclaimed those rights, that his community had supported him in doing so, and that his experience had helped protect other disabled individuals from similar discrimination, these were the things that mattered most. As the elevator reached the 14th floor, and Kenny stepped out into the familiar hallway. He thought about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, the subject of the presentation he'd been so excited to give on the day of the incident. Harriet Tubman had created networks of safety and support for people who deserved freedom, but had been denied it by systems of oppression. In his own small way, Kenny realized he'd helped create something similar. Not a railroad, but a community of people committed to inclusion and accessibility. Not routes to freedom, but policies and attitudes that ensured disabled people could live safely and with dignity in their own homes. It wasn't the kind of heroism that made history books, but it was the kind of everyday courage that made communities stronger, more just, and more welcoming for everyone. And as Kenny opened the door to apartment 14B, where his father was waiting with dinner and help with homework, he knew that sometimes the most important battles are won not on famous battlefields, but in apartment lobbies and community rooms, one conversation and one act of courage at a time. The story of Karen Whitmore's assault on Kenny Morrison had become more than just a case of individual discrimination. It had become a catalyst for broader change, a reminder that civil rights protections are only as strong as communities' willingness to enforce them, and a demonstration that sometimes the most powerful advocacy comes from 12-year-old boys who refuse to accept that their disabilities make them less deserving of respect, safety, and belonging. In the end, Karen's attempt to make Kenny feel unwelcome in his own building had accomplished exactly the opposite. It had made him more welcome, more valued, and more protected than ever before. And it had reminded an entire community that inclusion isn't just about following laws or policies. It's about recognizing the fundamental humanity and dignity of every person who shares our spaces, our neighborhoods, and our lives.